Patty Simpson with Simpson Math. In this video, we're going to look at fractions, decimals, and percents. All of those, fractions, decimals, and percents, are just part of a whole. The first one we're going to look at is a fraction. We write a fraction as the numerator over the denominator with that line in between we call the vinculum. And this just says we have 8 pieces out of 10. So if I had 10 pieces, like a pie cut into 10 pieces, 8 of them, 8 out of those 10 pieces is what we're looking at. So that's what a fraction is. It's just part of the whole. We can write that same exact amount, 8 out of 10 or 8/10, as a decimal. This decimal means the same thing as this fraction, 8/10. So this is the 10th place behind our decimal. That first place is called the 10th place. Then percents are always out of 100. So if I divided this, instead of looking at it in 10 pieces, if I divided it into 100 pieces, then that's what a percent is. It's always out of 100. So if we think of this fraction, 8/10, or the decimal sometimes is the easiest to look at, 8/10, think about dimes. This would say 80 cents, right? Well, that 0 to make it 80 cents, if I made this 80, it's still 8/10, 8 dimes. So that 10th place always reminds me of that's where our dimes are. They're worth that 10 cents. And it takes 10 of them to make $1. And so 8 out of the 10, there is 80 cents. This place is called the hundredths place. This is the hundredths place. Hundredths, tenths. And then I could keep adding zeros back there because, 8 dimes, 0 pennies is the same thing as just the 8 dimes, which is the same thing as if I put another 0 back there, maybe half pennies. If I have 0 of those, it's still just 80 cents. We call this place the thousandths place. This is our thousandths place. And then the next place would be our 10,000th place. And we can keep putting zeros because it's the same number. So, thinking of it with money is the easiest. 8 dimes and 0 pennies is the same as just 8 dimes. Now notice that here, when I go out to my hundredths place, I have 80. So it's 80 out of 100. 80 pennies out of 100 is the same as 8 dimes out of 100. So your percent is just always out of 100. So if I'm talking about 80%, I'm talking about 80 out of 100, which that's not what this fraction looks like, is it? It looks like 8 over 10, 8 out of 10. But it turns out this 8 out of 10 is the same thing as 80 out of 100. These numbers are all the same. 8/10, 8 out of 10 is the same as 80 100ths, 80 out of 100. And that's the same thing as this 8/10 or 80 hundredths or 800 thousandths. And then 80% is always out of 100. Now, when we do this with fractions, we can make, we call this making equivalent fractions. Think of it as multiplying by a fancy 1. If I multiply by 10 over 10, 10 divided by 10 is just 1. I'm multiplying by a fancy 1. 8 times 10 gives me 80. 10 times 10 gives me 100. These two fractions are equal to one another. This is that, like we said before, 8 dimes, and this is 80 pennies, and that's the same amount of money. So that's fractions, decimals, and percents are the same thing. They're just a part out of the whole. It's just that they're written, these are always out of 100, percents always out of 100, so your denominator is always 100. Our decimals are always out of tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, That's always our denominator. And then with fractions, we can have anything as our denominator there. So here, let's practice writing our number as a fraction, decimal, and percent. In this case, I gave you the number as a percent, 63%. Well, we know that 63% is just out of 100. So I could write that as a fraction as just 63 out of 100, or 63 hundredths. As a decimal, well, it's hundredths. So I know it's going to end up in the tenths, hundredths place. This 3 ends up in my hundredths place. So as a decimal, it's 63 hundredths. Here I was given the fraction, 9 out of 100, 9 hundredths. Well, we know that percent is always out of 100. So this would be easy to turn into the percent because it's just 9%. That 100 on the bottom, becomes a percent sign. There's the 1 and the 2 zeros. 9%. 9% means the same as 9 out of 100. The decimal's a little bit tricky here because here I have 9 out of 100, or 9 pennies. So I have to be careful to make sure that I put that 9 in the hundredths spot. Well, then what goes in my tenth spot? I have to have a placeholder there, and in that spot is a 0. Again, thinking of it as money, it takes 100 pennies to make $1. Well, 9 of those pennies would give me 9 out of 100, 9 cents, and then I wouldn't have any dimes. So this 9 hundredths is the same as 9 hundredths is the same as 9%. All those numbers mean exactly the same thing. Here I have 28 hundredths. Notice it goes out to the hundredths place. Here's my tenths place, my hundredths place. So I could rewrite that as a fraction. It's in the hundredths place, and then 28 out of 100. I can write it as a percent because it's out of the hundredths place. It's just 28%. Now, many times with fractions, we will reduce them or simplify them. So just like we did here when we multiplied by a fancy 1, because multiplying by 1 just gives you the same number. Think about if I multiply 7 times 1, I get 7. Or 5 times 1, I get 5. Here I'm just multiplying by a fancy 1, so that these two numbers, while they may look a little different, they're the same number. And we can do the same thing when we divide by a fancy 1. So in both of these cases, I could divide this by a fancy 1 that looks like this, where I have 4 over 4. 4 divided by 4 is just 1. I can divide by that fancy 1, and I could get, well, 28 divided by 4 is 7. 100 divided by 4 is 25. 7/25 is the same amount as 28 out of 100. These two numbers are the same number. I could say I have 28 cents out of 100, or I've got 7 out of 25. I ate 28 pieces out of 100 pieces, or I ate 7 out of 25 pieces. Those are the same amount of the pizza. So those two numbers, I always like to think of them as the same person. That here he is in his bathing suit, and there he is in his tuxedo, but they're the same guy, same amount. And so 28 100ths, 7/25, 28 hundredths, and 28% are all the exact same number, same part of a whole. Here I have a fraction, and I want to turn it into a decimal and into a percent. And I know that in order to turn it into a decimal or a percent, for a decimal it needs to have tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I need my denominator to be 10. Well, just like I did here where I divided by a fancy 1 or multiplied by a fancy 1, I'm going to use that strategy to help me come up with a decimal here. You could just simply divide. This says 1 divided by 5, and that would give you that fraction, that decimal as well. Or I can say, look, I want this to be tenths. If I had it in tenths, I could write it as a decimal. 5 times what gives me 10? Well, that's 5 times 2. Well, if I want to do it by a fancy 1 then my bottom and my top has to be the same so that it's equal to 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So multiply straight across, 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/5 is the same as 2/10. Those two things are the same number. So I can write this decimal in the tenths place, right there, is my 2. So for a decimal, I can just have it as a tenth. As a percent, I need it out of 100. So I could make this go out to the hundredths place to see, or I could take this same fraction and I could say, hey, I want it to have 100 in the denominator so I can make it into a percent. So what would I multiply 5 by to get to 100? Well, I would multiply that by 20. Again, I'm multiplying by a fancy 1, so the top and the bottom need to be the same. And 1 times 20 equals 20. So 20 hundredths is the same as 2 tenths, is the same as 1/5. I'm going to write this as 20 out of 100, or 20%. So those fractions, decimals, and percents are all just part of a whole. Percent is always out of 100. Decimals, your denominator is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, etc. And then our fractions, it's just the part out of the total number. Math Made Simple is Simpson Math. Thanks for watching.